Before her name made international headlines, Nancy Pfister was the toast of her ritzy mountain oasis.
Everybody wanted to be like Nancy. Everybody wanted to meet her. She didn't have a problem in the world.
She was briefly engaged to Michael Douglas. When the Kennedys would come into town, she would party with them.
In Aspen, she was the queen, for sure.
But a harrowing crime would send shockwaves through the glamorous Aspen community.
Ma'am, tell me exactly what happened.
I got my friend in the closet.
The body was completely wrapped in garbage bags. They see blonde hair and they notice, obviously, that it's a female.
The investigation would capture media attention around the nation.
Everybody was shocked at this gruesome murder here of a very well-loved local woman who had everything going for her.
As police search for answers, they'll uncover a desperate conspiracy, one that culminates in a tell-all confession that would leave those closest to the case shaken to their core.
She is the most self-loathing person that I've ever met.
That was just another indication to me that they were being framed.
She had screwed us up big time.
They bonded over their mutual, I have to say, hatred. And what desperate people do sometimes is lash out.
Known as the Beverly Hills of the Rocky Mountains, Aspen, Colorado is the winter retreat for the rich and famous.
Aspen is a playground for billionaires. You can get a beautiful house here. You can land your jet within 5 minutes of downtown. The skiing is 100% world class.
But on the evening of February 26, 2014, the glitz and glamour of the Aspen community would dissolve into chaos when local police dispatchers receive a frantic 911 call.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!
911, what is the address of the emergency?
Help me! Oh my God! Oh my God!
Ma'am, tell me exactly what happened.
Oh, okay. My friend had it. I got my friend in the closet.
What is your name, ma'am?
I'm Kathy Carpenter.
Okay, is your friend a male or a female?
Female Nancy sister.
Born in 1956, Nancy Pfister was brought up in an exclusive community.
Nancy is the daughter of Art Pfister. Art Pfister was a rancher that owned the property that was eventually developed into the Buttermilk ski area and the West Buttermilk super exclusive housing developments.
The Pfisters were like Aspen royalty. Everyone catered to them because they basically helped put Aspen on the map.
If her parents were royalty, Nancy was Aspen's princess.
She was like Aspen's daughter, the kid that grew up, that had everything. Everybody wanted to be like Nancy. Everybody wanted to meet her. She didn't have a problem in the world.
She was Aspen's welcome wagon. She was very friendly and outgoing and gregarious. She was briefly engaged to Michael Douglas. She was a girlfriend to Jack Nicholson. When the Kennedys would come into town, she would party with them.
You would see Nancy in town, and she was the sparkle. I mean, you knew that if you followed along with her, you were going to find some fun. Believe me, there was going to be some Prosecco. There was always someone to meet and someone to have fun with. She had the charm and the magic, and like the Pied Piper, you just followed her.
By the early 2000s, one of Nancy's closest followers was her best friend and personal assistant, Kathy Carpenter.
Kathy Carpenter was a bank teller at Alpine Bank in Aspen. This was the bank that Nancy Pfister banked at. Nancy Pfister, at one point, invited Kathy Carpenter to become her personal assistant.
Kathy Carpenter really cared about Nancy Pfister. She became her person, like to drive her different places. And I think she enjoyed it because she got invited around to places and things that she probably would not have gotten invited to had she not been with Nancy Pfister.
As a personal assistant, Kathy's biggest job was helping Nancy manage the rental of her luxurious chalet.
She would rent out her home on Buttermilk Mountain when she would leave town during the winter. She was traveling all over the world.
In November 2013, the 57-year-old socialite chose Australia for a 6-month getaway.
Nancy Pfister wanted to go to Australia, not only to get out of the cold weather of Aspen in the winter, but she was an adventurous woman, and she was thinking of potentially buying some property in Australia.
Nancy had told friends she'd be returning in May of 2014. But on February 26th, 3 months before Nancy's anticipated arrival, police get an alarming call from Kathy Carpenter, who tells them she's just found Nancy's body inside her Aspen home.
Okay, is she breathing?
She's dead, full of blood, wrapped in a thing.
Kathy Carpenter was screaming into the 911 dispatch officer, "My friend is dead, my friend is dead."
Ma'am, stay on the line with me. I'm going to have some additional questions for you, okay?
Okay. Okay.
Okay, are you with your friend now?
No, I left the house. I ran out of the house.
Kathy is frantic and screaming. She had just found her friend dead and didn't want to go back in the house. So she actually got in her car and starts driving down the mountain.
Where are you?
I'm driving to town. Out of the police department. It's not me.
Are you in a car?
Yes.
Okay, I want you to pull over and put your flashers on.
When deputies arrive, they realize Kathy is in serious distress.
She was so distraught that they had to use a sedative to calm her down.
While Kathy is being treated, deputies race to Nancy Pfister's house to investigate her claims.
Responding deputies go into the house, and in the call, they had been directed to the closet in this house. So they go to the closet. He opens the door. He's not immediately seeing a body. He takes a look on the floor at this pile of laundry. It looks like sheets on the floor. And he bends down and he pulls a sheet back and he sees a bit of shoulder. He reaches down, checks for signs of life. Having found none, he retreats, and the death investigation turns into a murder investigation.
Coming up, as investigators dig deeper into their victim's life, unsavory secrets come to light.
He sent Nancy Pfister an email saying, "Be careful what you wish for. You may get more than you expect."
It's always interesting when they don't like the deceased.
In Aspen, Colorado, investigators believe they have just found the body of 57-year-old socialite Nancy Pfister inside her bedroom closet.
The body was completely wrapped in garbage bags. So as detectives remove the plastic from the body, they see blonde hair and they notice, obviously, that it's a female. And so at that point, they're pretty sure that it's Nancy Pfister.
That trash bag around the head ended up concealing the actual cause of death. And that was blunt force trauma to the head.
But something about the crime scene doesn't add up for investigators.
There was a smear of blood that was noticed on the headboard of the bed in the master bedroom. There was some droplets of blood, maybe spray on the bedroom wall, but not substantial amounts of blood that you would think based upon the head injuries that we were seeing on the body of Nancy Pfister.
As detectives take a closer look at Nancy's bed, they make a telling discovery.
There was an area of a sizable amount of blood on the underside of the mattress. So we know our killer took the time and they worked to conceal what had actually happened.
Based on the blood evidence, investigators believe Nancy had been attacked while she slept. As they continue processing the scene, they find little evidence to suggest a motive.
They weren't seeing a ransacked bedroom where somebody was going through drawers and dumping drawers and looking for jewelry and things like that. There was no evidence of that.
While Nancy Pfister's body is transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy, investigators circle back to Nancy's friend and the woman who called 911, Kathy Carpenter, for more information.
Once Kathy calms down, she meets with investigators at the police department, and they ask her to walk them through the crime scene and how she came to find Nancy's body. And she tells them that Nancy just returned from Australia a few days before.
She had to go over to the house to check on the dog, Gabe, and she knew that Nancy Pfister would be sleeping because, she'd be jet lagged.
When Kathy arrived, she noticed the dog hadn't been fed and had gone to the bathroom inside Nancy's house multiple times.
It's obvious that something is wrong. She goes up the stairs and she sees what looks like bloodstains on the headboard. She looks to the closet and she noticed that the key that she had left in it was gone.
She went and grabbed her spare set of keys to Nancy's house and she unlocked the closet door. And at that point, she says she saw a figure in the corner wrapped in garbage bags. Looks a little bit closer and sees that it's in fact a body.
That's when Kathy drops a bombshell. She believes she knows who killed her best friend, the couple who had been renting Nancy Pfister's home while she was in Australia. Trey and Nancy Styler.
Trey Styler was a young resident in 1980 at the very prestigious University of Colorado Hospital in Denver when he met Nancy Styler. She was a nurse anesthetist at the time. She was very wowed and impressed by Trey Styler's intelligence. He, in turn, was surprised at someone with her looks.
The pair eventually married and had a son. For the next 30 years, Trey's career and their fortunes continued to rise.
He finally became chief of anesthesiology at St. Joseph's Hospital in Denver, which is another quite acclaimed hospital. They were living in a suburb of Denver called Greenwood Village, which is a quite affluent suburb in a very large house.
But things took a turn for the worse when Trey's health began to deteriorate in his early 60s, and he was diagnosed with a degenerative nerve condition called Charcot-Marie tooth disease.
He was not able to stand for long periods of time and had to use a wheelchair at other times.
He could hardly walk down the stairs. I don't know how he was functioning. He was either in so much pain or he was so sick he could barely do anything.
Because of his health condition, Trey was no longer able to practice medicine, and the couple had to look for new avenues to make money.
Nancy wanted to get into the skincare thing because being a nurse, she could do Botox and she could do treatments that were expensive. So that would be an opportunity for her to make a lot of money.
So they had this idea to go up to Aspen They knew that that's where the money was, and that's where they wanted to start the spa business.
The Styler story won Nancy Pfister over.
Nancy Pfister and the Stylers worked out an agreement where the Stylers would rent her house for 6 months. The Stylers would pay her $12,000, $6,000 up front, and then $6,000 when they moved in as part of that agreement.
When they met, they were buddies. You know, Nancy Pfister would take her to the hot springs, and I'm going to introduce you to my wealthy friends in Aspen so that you'll have, professional contacts.
Nancy also invited the Stylers to move in early so she could help them settle in before she left for her trip.
When they moved into Nancy Pfister's house, Nancy Pfister was still there. She hadn't left yet to Australia. So they lived with her for about 2 or 3 weeks before she took off.
In November 2013, Nancy Pfister left for Australia. But it wasn't long after that her relationship and rental agreement with the Stylers quickly began to unravel. 8 weeks after she left the country, Nancy Pfister had emailed Kathy Carpenter from Australia and claimed that the Stylers still owed her thousands of dollars in rent.
Trey Styler and Nancy Pfister were on Facebook together. They were friends. And she started posting really negative things on Facebook, and Trey was seeing this. And this is when Nancy Styler really became angry, because she was ruining their reputation, basically, and their prospects of being able to meet new people, get new clients, because Nancy Pfister was very influential.
She was sending them group emails. Kathy Carpenter was CC'd. Everybody was on this email. Help me, do something with these people. Get them out of there. Get me my money. Anything, do something. And it was an ongoing theme. I heard less about her happiness there than I did about her anger about not getting the money.
Kathy tells police that by mid-February, Nancy Pfister decided to fly home from Australia 3 months early to take care of the issue in person.
Nancy Pfister told the Stylers that she would be back in Aspen in a few days and to get all of their belongings out.
Once Nancy got back to town, the Stylers moved out of her house and rented a hotel room in Basalt, which is down valley from Aspen. They moved some of their belongings out of her house, but there was still hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment still left in the house that they were going to use to build their spa that Nancy refused to give back to them until they paid her the money she said they owed her.
Nancy Pfister says, you owe me $14,000, you damaged my furniture, you did other things around my house. I'm not going to give you back your equipment, this expensive equipment that Nancy Styler had in her spa business, unless you hand over $14,000. I mean, they didn't have anything approaching $14,000. That's what Trey basically told Kathy Carpenter. We can't come up with this money. He was already angry. His wife was already angry, very angry with Nancy Pfister.
Trey Styler at one point sent Nancy Pfister an email saying, "Be careful what you wish for. You may get more than you expect."
The mountain town of Aspen, Colorado is reeling after police find 57-year-old Nancy Pfister dead from an apparent homicide.
Who in their wildest dream would think something like this would happen? Especially to somebody like Nancy Pfister. She doesn't have an enemy in the world.
Nancy's best friend, Kathy Carpenter, has implicated the late socialite's former friends and tenants, 65-year-old Trey Styler and his 62-year-old wife, Nancy, as her possible killers.
Within about 12 hours of finding Nancy Pfister's body, police went to the hotel in Basalt where Kathy said the Stylers were staying.
They asked them to come in and answer some questions.
At the station, when investigators confront Nancy about her and her husband's feud with Nancy Pfister, she doesn't deny it. Instead, she tells police that Nancy Pfister had been a demanding landlord since the moment they moved into her home.
Nancy Styler told police that initially the relationship between the couple and Nancy Pfister, they became fast friends, but once the Stylers signed the lease on her house, the relationship quickly changed and went downhill.
And for 2 days, she was good. Until she got our money. And the deal was kind of, sealed. Right. And then she treated me like a slave.
Nancy Pfister would say things like, "Bring me my champagne, darling," or "Rub my feet, darling," or "Rub my neck, darling." And she would say this to both Nancy Styler and Trey Styler. And Nancy Styler also said that Nancy Pfister would walk around the house nude in front of her husband, and that didn't sit well. So Trey Styler told his wife, "Just be patient. She's going to be leaving in a few weeks. We can put up with her for a little bit longer." But you could tell it was getting to Nancy Styler.
She was very forthcoming in her dislike for Nancy Pfister. Now, hating someone doesn't mean you kill them, but it's always interesting when law enforcement talks to someone and that someone is saying very openly how much they don't like the deceased.
When detectives press Nancy Styler about their whereabouts the past week, she claims she and her husband hadn't seen Nancy Pfister since she returned from Australia.
Nancy Styler said that the last time they'd been to Nancy Pfister's house was to move their belongings out because they didn't want to see Nancy Pfister once she returned from her trip. Once Nancy returned from her trip, they didn't have access to the house, so they couldn't have been there when Nancy Pfister was killed.
In another interrogation room, Trey Styler echoes his wife's alibi.
She had screwed us up big time and made the situation uncomfortable.
Mr. Styler had run into some severe difficulties in his life, career-wise, financially. I don't think Nancy brought in much money, as I recall. They ended up in pretty dire financial straits, and they were trying to rebuild their life up here.
Do you feel bad about that she's done? A little.
Sensing their suspicions, Trey quickly points out his physical ailments to police.
My condition is such that I don't think I could beat up a kid.
He had to leave his medical profession because he could no longer physically meet the demands of his job in the operating room by standing. By this point, law enforcement knows, whoever this killer was, flipped a big, bulky, heavy, king-size mattress. Whoever the killer or killers was, moved a body. They're thinking there needs to be some strength there, some stature there. That's kind of hard to do on your own. So, Trey and Nancy Styler, no evidence to hold them, no evidence they had committed any type of crime. They're released and they go back down to Basalt to their motel room where they sit. We had had a deputy sitting, watching that room.
The following day, police receive a call from a sanitation worker in Basalt who believes he has just made a crucial discovery.
That Friday, one of the workers whose job was to pick up the recyclable material went into one of these dumpsters where the material was, and there are very strict rules that you cannot put personal trash in there. He saw a bag that appeared to be personal trash. He was annoyed. He opened it up.
What was remarkable about that trash bag is in it had prescription medication bottles with the name of Nancy Pfister. In this small valley, in this small community, the gentleman that checked on that immediately knew he had come across something that might be of interest to law enforcement.
When investigators arrive, they collect several more valuable pieces of evidence.
A document that was of extreme interest that was found in this trash bag was a vehicle registration belonging to none other than William Trey Styler and his vehicle. And then we found a bloody hammer.
This was the first evidentiary connection between one of the Stylers and a piece of evidence in the murder itself.
The evidence is a huge break for investigators, especially when they realize where it was found.
Maybe 200 yards from a certain hotel that was of interest to law enforcement. Because that hotel, this modest hotel in Basalt, Colorado, contained Trey and Nancy Styler.
While investigators are waiting for forensic results, the hotel's owner makes another key discovery outside the Stylers' room.
Does a morning check, checking to see just if everything's all right, if anything needs to be tidied up. In a matter of a few feet from the motel room door of Trey and Nancy Styler, it's a key, and on that key it had a tag, and on that tag it was written owner's closet. It's the key to the closet where Nancy Pfister's body was found.
The discovery is a game changer. And when the DNA results on the potential murder weapon come back from the crime lab, the case against the Stylers is seemingly solidified.
The blood on the hammer, through DNA testing, proved to be connected to Trey Styler. Both the physical evidence, which had come out of that bag, and Kathy Carpenter's statements about all the conflict that was going on led the police to feel that they had probable cause to make an arrest.
Coming up, as investigators build their case, a shocking revelation suggests the Stylers might not be the real killers after all.
Now we're having discussions. Did the Stylers really do this? Or are the Stylers being set up?
That was just another indication to me that the Stylers are being framed.
In Aspen, Colorado, authorities have arrested married couple Trey and Nancy Styler for the murder of their former friend and local celebrity, Nancy Pfister. News of the arrest stuns the close-knit community.
I couldn't believe it. When I was there, they were all having fun together, laughing, joking, hugging each other, toasting a drink. I was shocked when I first heard it.
As investigators continue building their case against the Stylers, they struggle to comprehend the killer's carelessness with the evidence.
It just raises this fundamental question. If that's a key piece of evidence that would tie you into a murder, why would you leave it 20 steps away from the door of where you're staying at the motel?
Now we're having discussions. Did the Stylers really do this? Or are the Stylers being set up?
Investigators start looking at the possibility that the Stylers are being framed, or that someone else may be in on it, and is planting evidence to pin the murder exclusively on Nancy and Trey. But who would have the motive and the opportunity?
One of the crucial pieces of evidence was that there was a key to the closet that was found very close to the Stylers' motel room.
This was the key to the owner's closet that was missing.
But when it was tested, they were looking to see who had touched that key. It was Kathy Carpenter who had some forensic type evidence on that key. She had obviously access to that key. That was the biggest fact that made me start to think that maybe the Stylers were being framed by Kathy Carpenter.
Investigators decide to revisit Kathy's statements to police. They begin by examining her 911 call.
Kathy said in her 911 call that there was blood all over the body and that when she opened the closet door, she was able to see that it was Nancy Pfister.
Okay, is she breathing?
She's dead, full of blood, wrapped in a thing.
Okay, ma'am, can you get near your friend?
No, I can't. She's full of blood.
The problem with that was that investigators, when they arrived on scene, couldn't see any blood on the body and in fact had to unwrap the body from the garbage bags and the sheets in order to see any blood at all.
If you took a look at the crime scene photos, you couldn't tell if it was a man, if it was a woman. All you could see was a little bit of white skin, and you saw sheets. Her head had been concealed, actually sealed up in another trash bag. There was nothing to indicate any identity of this person.
Detectives realized Kathy had also been quick to push suspicion toward the Stylers when she was interviewed by police.
Kathy Carpenter immediately mentioned the Stylers. The Stylers were delivered to us on this platter of people that we should be interested in.
Investigators speak with Nancy Pfister's friends to discuss her relationship with Kathy Carpenter. They learn Kathy had become increasingly bitter about her 7-year friendship with Nancy Pfister.
Nancy Pfister always wanted to be a little bit above these people that she had around her. They didn't seem to be relationships of equals. So there was some indication that maybe Nancy Pfister didn't always treat her that well, and there was some animosity.
One time, we were sitting on the sofa chatting, and she said, "Kathy," she screamed for Kathy, who was downstairs, and said, "We ran out of Prosecco. Go get us some more Prosecco." We ran out, and all of a sudden, you hear a car peeling out of that gravel driveway as fast as it could. Kathy was angry. She was tired of being pushed around, but she was pushed around an awful lot. Get me this, get me that.
Friends also reveal that Kathy had become close with the Stylers while Nancy was traveling overseas.
Part of Kathy's job was to take care of Nancy Pfister's house. So she was over there all the time, and while she was over there, she got to know the Stylers and started spending some personal time with them.
They got to know each other, and they got to share their grievances about Nancy Pfister.
Investigators began hearing more and more stories about the Stylers and Kathy Carpenter hanging around town and openly bad-mouthing Nancy Pfister.
On March 1st, police decide to bring Kathy in for another round of questioning. They press her about the inconsistencies in her 911 call and previous statements.
Kathy Carpenter, her interview with us sticks to, "Hey, I knew that was my friend. How did you know that was your friend?" is what we ask her as law enforcement investigators. And at one point in the interview, she actually reaches up to her own head and she said, "It's the hair. It's the hair." And she starts stroking. I recognized her blonde hair. There was no hair free-flowing from underneath this sealed bag that was actually literally tied around the neck of Nancy Pfister.
Still, Kathy refuses to implicate herself.
It's time. Unburden your heart. Let's talk about the truth. Let's talk about what happened. It's time, Kathy. You can't keep...
I didn't do it. I don't know what to say. I was not in cahoots. I do not know what to say.
In cahoots
with the Stylers.
Despite her claims of innocence, authorities believe they have enough circumstantial evidence against Kathy. 11 days after the Stylers were taken into custody, Kathy Carpenter is the third person arrested and charged with Nancy Pfister's murder.
When she got arrested with the Stylers, I was really surprised that she was involved.
When I first heard about it, I couldn't believe it. Like, holy moly, what the hell did Kathy do?
Coming up, an unexpected confession threatens to upend the case, leading to more questions, theories, and doubts about what really happened to Nancy Pfister.
This was a resolution that was distasteful and disgusting to me as a cop.
It was so shocking that they could lie to that extent.
In the winter of 2014, law enforcement in Aspen, Colorado have indicted 3 people for the murder of celebrated socialite Nancy Pfister, her former close friends and tenants Nancy and Trey Styler, and her longtime assistant and friend Kathy Carpenter. As the first preliminary hearing approaches, prosecutors solidify their theory for motive.
Kathy Carpenter being a follower, needing somebody to show her attention, she found that in the Stylers. And they bonded over their mutual hatred of Nancy Pfister. We believe that the Stylers were the driving force. Stylers lost everything. They had nowhere to go. They were desperate. They were lost. They just didn't know what to do. And what desperate people do sometimes is lash out.
Then, 1 week before the preliminary hearing is scheduled, Trey Styler makes an unexpected plea.
Trey Styler contacts through his lawyer the prosecution team and says, I want to talk to you. So they bring him in his wheelchair, and he tells them, I did this. I did it all by myself.
According to Trey Styler, on the morning of February 25th, he went to Nancy Pfister's house to try and talk with her about the escalating drama.
Trey admits to police that he still had a key to the house, so he lets himself in.
He goes up the stairs. He doesn't hear anything there. He goes into Nancy Pfister's bedroom. He walks in the door. He sees her sleeping in her bed. She has on her eye mask and her earplugs, which is what she was known for. And she's just lying there in front of him.
He said he saw her there sleeping, and he just felt this rage, and he crushed her head with a hammer.
After Trey was sure Nancy Pfister was dead, he tells investigators how he cleaned up his crime.
He said he and he alone moved her body to the floor. He said he and he alone dragged her body to the closet, wrapped her in sheets. He said he and he alone flipped the mattress.
Investigators heard his story, but they weren't buying it. They did not believe that he could have acted on his own.
He was always in a wheelchair. So it was always a question of how much could he actually move, stand, lift. And when asked about committing that crime, he just said, well, I can only attribute it to the adrenaline effect.
In exchange for his cooperation, Trey asks authorities to drop the charges against his wife Nancy and Kathy Carpenter.
I sat in that interview room just not believing Trey Styler. He was throwing himself on the sword. He was taking the rap so Nancy could go free. He was also telling us Kathy Carpenter had no involvement in this at all.
From my review of the evidence, I just didn't see anything that suggested that Nancy Styler had anything to do with it.
Without any physical evidence to disprove his story, authorities know they won't have a foolproof case against Nancy Styler or Kathy Carpenter.
After Trey Styler had confessed to the murder, Nancy Styler and Kathy Carpenter were basically let off. Nancy Styler was let off with prejudice, which means that she could never be charged with the case again. Kathy Carpenter, on the other hand, was released without prejudice, in legal terms meaning that she was still under the umbrella of suspicion.
On June 20th, 2014, Trey Styler pleads guilty to second-degree murder inside a packed Aspen courtroom. He's sentenced to 20 years in prison. While justice is served in the case against Trey Styler, not everyone agrees with the district attorney's decision.
I would not have signed on to participate in the arrest of Trey and Nancy Styler if I didn't believe both were part of committing the murder of Nancy Pfister. I wholeheartedly believed when I signed on to participate in the arrest and be part of it that Kathy Carpenter was involved in the murder of Nancy Pfister. This was a resolution that was distasteful and disgusting to me as a cop, but at least we were holding someone accountable. Everybody could have gone free.
Following his incarceration, Trey Styler agrees to sit down with a book author and describes how he committed the murder despite his medical condition.
I still had some of her body strength.
And once
my lower body from the waist down, I was shot.
In his interview, Trey also reiterates his wife's innocence.
The idea of her doing such a thing or being involved in such a thing is so insane to me. When they arrested her, that destroyed me.
In August 2015, barely a year after his guilty plea, Trey kills himself in his prison cell.
He hung himself in his cell, hung himself to death.
He took the easy way out, and I'd rather see him rot in prison. You know, he should suffer.
As for Nancy Styler and Kathy Carpenter, they both still vehemently maintain their innocence.
In my heart, I did not believe she had anything to do with this murder. Nancy loved her husband. It completely blew her mind that this man that she was married to was capable of this kind of an act.
Today, there's still a strong feeling in the Aspen community that the case may never be fully resolved.
In the aftermath of the crime, there was a lot of anger in Aspen among people we interviewed, among people we talked to, who absolutely felt that justice had not been done for Nancy Pfister.
The town of Aspen loved Nancy Pfister. Okay? She was iconic. She lived her life the way she wanted to live it. She had fun. And she had fun a lot. And she shared her good fortune and her friendship with all of her friends. She was too young to pass. She had too much life left in her. We just pray to God it never happens to anyone else again.
The last time Michelle McMullen spoke to her son, there was nothing in her voice to suggest that the night would become the beginning of a mystery that would consume her family for months. She had just dropped 6-year-old Jaden off in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. She was supposed to be heading back toward Louisiana, toward Grambling State University, toward the life she had been trying to rebuild. 17 hours of highway stretched between Pennsylvania and Louisiana. It was a long drive, but Michelle had made long drives before. At around 9 that night, she called a friend and said goodnight to her son. Then the phone went silent. First, nobody thought of murder. Nobody thought of an elaborate disappearance. The simplest explanation was an accident somewhere along the highway. A wreck. A mechanical failure. A hospital where no one knew her name. Her family waited for another call. It never came. Then investigators found the car. Michelle's 2002 Honda Accord was discovered in Hagerstown, Maryland, several days after she vanished. Inside were items that made the situation immediately more disturbing: her cell phone, wallet, and identification. The woman was gone, but the things that could have helped her identify herself were still sitting inside the vehicle. Police searched the surrounding area, but there was no clear indication that she had been attacked. At that stage, investigators said there was no evidence pointing directly to foul play. For Michelle's father, Michael McMullen, that conclusion was almost impossible to accept. His daughter was a mother. She had a 6-year-old son. She was a student. She was working toward a degree. Whatever problems existed in her life, he believed she would never simply abandon her child. But detectives were looking at something else. Before Michelle disappeared, police had been investigating missing money from the church where she had worked as an administrator. Reports at the time said an audit had uncovered thousands of dollars missing. Investigators were examining allegations involving theft and forgery. Michelle was not simply a missing woman in the eyes of every agency involved. She was also wanted in connection with an active criminal investigation. That changed the story. To her family, Michelle was a daughter who had vanished. To police, she could also have been someone deliberately avoiding arrest. And that difference would shape the investigation. Her father rejected the idea that a financial investigation could explain why his daughter disappeared. He insisted that whatever happened with the church had nothing to do with her disappearance. He argued that Michelle had a future to protect and a child she loved. Walking away from everything over money made no sense to him. But detectives had to follow evidence, not emotion. Weeks passed. Then came a strange lead from West Virginia. In December 2008, investigators received information that Michelle might be working at a hotel in Martinsburg. The name attached to the woman was not Michelle McMullen. It was Monique Watson. Police moved quickly. By the time investigators arrived, the woman had already disappeared. But the sighting was enough. Michelle had not simply vanished from the map. Someone matching her description had apparently been living under another name. The investigation changed direction again. The family had feared that Michelle had been taken. Now police had reason to believe she might have been hiding. And the question became more complicated. If Michelle was alive, why had she abandoned the identity everyone knew? Why leave behind her car? Why leave her phone? Why use another name? And most importantly, where had she gone? In Harrisburg, the disappearance remained deeply unsettling. Her parents had spent months believing their daughter could be somewhere in danger. Every unidentified body, every anonymous tip, every possible sighting carried the same unbearable possibility. Then in January 2011, more than 2 years after Michelle disappeared, a woman watching a television program recognized her. The program was about Michelle's disappearance. The viewer believed she knew where Michelle was. California. Oakland. Another name. Another life. The tip reached authorities. Investigators followed it. And this time they found her. Michelle was alive. She had been working as a hairdresser under the alias Danielle Jones. After years of uncertainty, the mystery that had begun with an abandoned Honda finally had an answer. There was no killer waiting at the end of the investigation. No hidden grave. No DNA sample revealing a murderer. No courtroom confrontation between a grieving family and an accused assassin. Instead, there was something more complicated. A woman who had deliberately separated herself from the life she had left behind. A family that had spent years fearing the worst. And a police investigation that had slowly uncovered the truth through names, locations, tips, and persistence. Michelle was returned to Pennsylvania. The criminal allegations that had existed before her disappearance followed her home. She ultimately faced charges related to theft, fraud, and forgery. According to accounts of the case, she said the money had been taken for schooling and described it as a mistake. A judge ordered restitution and imposed probation, with the sentence reported as time served. But for her family, the legal outcome was only one part of the story. The deeper wound had been the uncertainty. For months they had not known whether Michelle was alive. They did not know whether she had been abducted. They did not know whether she was being held somewhere against her will. They did not know whether the abandoned Honda was the final trace of a crime. They had only questions. And questions can become their own kind of prison. The case also reveals something unsettling about missing person investigations. A disappearance does not always begin with a crime. Sometimes the first mystery is not who took the missing person. It is whether anyone took them at all. Michelle's case became a collision between those possibilities. Her family saw a daughter who would never willingly leave her child. Investigators saw evidence suggesting that she knew she was being investigated. The abandoned car suggested danger. The later sightings suggested planning. The aliases suggested intention. And eventually, the woman herself provided the final answer. She had not been kidnapped. She had not been murdered. She had chosen to leave. That revelation transformed the entire meaning of the case. The Honda in Hagerstown was no longer necessarily the scene of a crime. It became a piece of a carefully constructed disappearance. The phone left behind was no longer evidence that someone had taken her. It was another sign that Michelle had wanted distance. The false names were no longer clues to a criminal mastermind. They were the fingerprints of someone attempting to build a new identity. And yet, even after Michelle was found, the case left behind uncomfortable questions. What had happened during those missing years? What was Michelle thinking when she drove away? What did she tell herself as she crossed state lines? Did she expect her family to stop looking? Did she understand how much fear her disappearance created? And when she finally heard that people were still searching for her, did she realize that the story she had tried to leave behind had never stopped following her? Those questions belong to the human side of the case. Because sometimes the most haunting missing person stories do not end with a body being found. Sometimes they end with a living person standing in front of investigators after years of uncertainty. Alive. Identified. Found. And still surrounded by unanswered questions. Michelle McMullen's disappearance began on a Pennsylvania night in September 2008. It passed through an abandoned car in Maryland. It crossed into West Virginia under the name Monique Watson. It eventually reached Oakland, California, where another name, Danielle Jones, concealed the identity investigators had been searching for. The trail stretched across states and years. But the final clue was not blood. It was recognition. Someone saw a television story. Someone remembered a face. Someone made a phone call. And that call ended a disappearance that had once seemed capable of becoming a permanent mystery. For the people who loved Michelle, the moment she was found alive must have carried two emotions at once. Relief. And pain. Relief because the nightmare of finding a dead daughter was over. Pain because the truth was not the one they had hoped for. She had been alive. She had been somewhere else. And she had chosen not to come home. That is what makes the Michelle McMullen case so difficult to place neatly into a single category. It is a missing person investigation. It is a story about family. It is a story about identity. It is also a story about the dangerous gap between what a family believes and what investigators can prove. For more than 2 years, Michelle existed in that gap. A photograph on a missing person report. A name in police databases. A daughter someone desperately wanted home. And somewhere far away, a woman living under another name. Until one day, the two identities became one again. Michelle McMullen was no longer missing. But the mystery of why she left remained the part of the story that could never be erased. Because sometimes the most powerful ending in a disappearance is not a confession. Not an arrest. Not a body. It is the moment the missing person finally walks back into the light. And everyone realizes that the mystery was never about where she was. It was about why she wanted to disappear. By the time investigators began looking beyond Pennsylvania, the case had already taken on a life of its own. Michelle McMullen had disappeared. Her Honda had been found abandoned in Maryland. and her family was still holding on to the belief that something terrible had happened to her. But behind the scenes, another version of the story was beginning to emerge. Started with a name. Not Michelle McMullen. Monique Watson. The name surfaced in Martinsburg, West Virginia, several months after Michelle vanished. A woman matching Michelle's description had reportedly been working at a hotel. The sighting was not a vague rumor from a stranger passing through town. It came from someone who recognized her. Investigators were alerted. Officers moved toward the hotel. And then, just before they arrived, the woman disappeared again. According to accounts of the investigation, Michelle had been working at the Knights Inn in Martinsburg under the alias Monique Watson. When someone at the hotel recognized her from photographs connected to the missing person case, she reportedly became uneasy, left the front desk and never returned. Police arrived only minutes later. The woman they had been searching for was gone. That moment changed everything. For months, Michelle's family had been asking one question. Where is she? Now investigators had a different question. Why was she running? The answer would not come immediately. What they knew was that Michelle had crossed state lines. She had apparently found work. She had found a place to stay. She had created a name that was not her own. That meant the disappearance was no longer simply a mystery of location. It was a mystery of identity. The woman who had vanished from Harrisburg appeared to be actively constructing another life. And that life had begun with a lie. Investigators reportedly learned that Michelle had been living and working at the Martinsburg Hotel under the name Monique Watson, and that another variation, Monique Whitson, had also been used. Inside the hotel room associated with her, authorities reportedly found material relating to false identification. For a family desperate to believe that their daughter had been abducted, these details were devastating. But they did not necessarily answer the most important question. Why? Why would a 27-year-old mother leave behind her 6-year-old son? Why would she abandon her phone, wallet, and identification? Why would she travel under false names? Why would she risk being arrested? The financial investigation surrounding her disappearance had already complicated the case. Michelle had been working as an administrator at Progress Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Pennsylvania. After an audit, investigators reported that approximately $2,000 to $2,400 was missing. She had been fired in July 2008, and police later issued a warrant accusing her of theft by unlawful taking, theft by deception, and forgery. Her father, Michael McMullen, did not believe the accusations explained what happened to his daughter. He believed she had been abducted. He believed the missing money and the disappearance were separate events. And every time police emphasized the warrant, he feared the investigation was moving away from the person he wanted found. His daughter. But the Martinsburg sighting made the situation harder to explain as an abduction. Someone had seen Michelle alive. Someone had watched her working. Someone had recognized her. And when police came looking, she fled. There was no body. No crime scene. No confirmed attacker. No evidence publicly indicating that another person was controlling her movements. Instead, there was a trail. A trail made of names. Hotels. Telephone calls. Sightings. And sudden departures. The trail would continue west. After leaving Martinsburg, Michelle eventually made her way toward California. Later accounts of the case reported that she traveled by train toward Washington, D.C., then continued west, eventually reaching the Bay Area. The farther she traveled, the more distant Pennsylvania became. But distance was not the same as disappearance. Michelle was still somewhere. She was simply becoming harder to recognize. In California, another name appeared. Danielle Jones. It was a new identity for a woman who had already been known as Michelle McMullen and before that, had reportedly used the name Monique Watson. 3 names. 1 person. And each name seemed to belong to a different version of her life. In the Oakland area, Danielle found work in a hair salon. She built relationships. She established herself as someone with a different past. According to later accounts, people around her knew her by the name Danielle and believed the background story she had created. This was perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire disappearance. Michelle had not simply gone somewhere remote. She had entered another community. She worked. She interacted with people. She created friendships. She lived among strangers who had no reason to suspect that the woman they knew had been the subject of a nationwide search. And all the while, the original case remained alive. Her photograph continued to circulate. Her name remained associated with the disappearance. Investigators still wanted answers. Her family still wanted their daughter home. But California was thousands of miles away from the place where the trail had begun. For Michelle, every mile created another layer of separation. Pennsylvania was becoming a former life. Louisiana was a former destination. West Virginia was another abandoned chapter. Now California offered anonymity. For a while it worked. There was no dramatic police chase. No sudden confession. No detective waiting outside a locked apartment. Instead, the case moved quietly. The most important weapon investigators had was publicity. Michelle's disappearance had been featured on television. Her photograph had been shown to viewers who knew nothing about her except the story attached to her face. That exposure mattered. Because eventually, someone who knew the face behind the name saw her again. The television program Disappeared aired an episode about Michelle McMullen's disappearance in February 2010. The program presented the mystery to a national audience. Her photograph was shown. Her disappearance was explained. The strange trail from Pennsylvania to Maryland and West Virginia became part of a televised search for answers. Michelle was still in California. Still living under another name. Still outside the life she had left behind. But now her face was on television. And somewhere someone was watching. That detail would eventually become the turning point. Because the person who recognized Michelle did not need to know her entire history. She only needed to recognize her face. In January 2011, approximately 3 years after Michelle disappeared, authorities received information that she was living and working in Oakland under the name Danielle Jones. A woman who had seen the television program reportedly recognized her and contacted authorities. The search that had begun with an abandoned Honda was about to end thousands of miles away. Police went to the location. Michelle was identified. The woman known locally as Danielle Jones was Michelle McMullen. Alive. That single fact destroyed the darkest possibility that had haunted her family since 2008. She had not been found in a remote location. She had not been discovered after years of forensic investigation. She had not been identified through a DNA breakthrough. She was simply there. Working. Living. Existing under another identity. The missing woman had been found because somebody recognized her. And with that recognition came a flood of questions. Why did she leave? Why did she choose those names? Why did she never contact her family? Why did she continue to live under false identities, even after people were searching for her? Those questions became more important than the question of where she was. Because now investigators knew where she had been. They knew she had traveled. They knew she had worked. They knew she had used aliases. But the private reasoning inside Michelle's mind could never be reconstructed completely. Her disappearance had been visible from the outside. Its motivation remained deeply personal. After she was returned to Pennsylvania, the criminal allegations that had existed before her disappearance were waiting for her. She faced charges connected to the church money and forged documents. According to later accounts, Michelle said the money had been taken for schooling and characterized it as a mistake. The courtroom would eventually provide an ending to the legal side of the story. But not necessarily to the emotional side. Because finding a missing person does not automatically repair the damage caused by the disappearance. For Michelle's parents, there had been years of uncertainty. Years of wondering whether she was alive. Years of wondering whether someone had hurt her. Years of seeing her photograph and imagining the worst. And then came the truth. She had been alive. She had been living far away. And according to a statement attributed to Michelle, she had not been kidnapped or forced to remain away. She said the choices that led her to leave were her own. Those words changed the meaning of the entire investigation. The abandoned Honda was no longer the beginning of a homicide mystery. It was the beginning of a disappearance that had been deliberate. The aliases were no longer clues left behind by an unknown criminal. They were evidence of a new identity. The sightings were no longer proof that someone had taken Michelle. They were proof that Michelle had survived. And the television program that had once been another attempt to solve the mystery became the instrument that finally exposed where she was. A face on a screen. A memory. A phone call. And 3 years of uncertainty ended. Yet the case remains haunting precisely because there was no conventional crime story ending. There was no killer. No murder weapon. No grave.
No final forensic revelación.
There was only a woman who disappeared and a family that refused to stop looking. And somewhere between Pennsylvania and California, Michelle McMullen had built a life that almost erased the person everyone else was searching for. Almost. Because no matter how many names she used, the face remained the same. And eventually someone recognized it. That is how the long drive home ended. Not on a lonely highway. Not beside an abandoned vehicle. But in California, under a name that was never hers, when someone looked at a television image and realized that the missing woman everyone had been searching for was much closer than anyone imagined. Michelle McMullen had not vanished from the world. She had vanished from her old life. And for years, the difference between those two things was almost impossible for anyone else to see. The moment investigators confirmed that the woman in Oakland was Michelle McMullen, the case that had consumed her family for years suddenly looked completely different. For more than 2 years, Michelle had existed in the space reserved for the missing. A photograph. A name. A date. A description. Possibility. Now there was a living person standing behind that photograph. But finding her did not erase the mystery. It only changed its shape. The question was no longer whether Michelle was alive. She was. The question was why she had made herself disappear. That distinction would follow the case long after the search itself was over. In September 2008, Michelle had been a 27-year-old mother living in Pennsylvania. She had a young son, a job history, plans for school and a complicated financial situation. Then she disappeared. Her Honda was discovered in Maryland. Her identification and personal belongings were reportedly still inside. Investigators initially considered multiple possibilities, including the possibility that she had been harmed. But there was no confirmed evidence of a homicide. abcnews.com, https://abcnews.com/us/story?ID =$6005233 page =$1 UTM_source =ChatGPT.com. The absence of evidence became one of the defining features of the case. No body. No confirmed crime scene. No known attacker. No reliable eyewitness account of an assault. Instead, there was a vehicle sitting where Michelle was no longer present. For her family, that emptiness was terrifying. For investigators, it was frustrating. A missing person case can become a race against time because every hour matters. Every unexplained movement matters. Every phone call matters. Every person who may have seen the missing individual becomes important. But Michelle's case became even more complicated when investigators discovered that she was also wanted in connection with an alleged financial crime. That fact created a second narrative. One narrative said a young mother had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The other suggested a woman facing criminal allegations had deliberately left before authorities could find her. Both narratives could exist at the same time. And for a long period, investigators had no way to know which one explained the disappearance. Then came Martinsburg. The hotel. The alias. The woman who looked like Michelle. The sudden departure. Those details provided the strongest indication yet that Michelle might be controlling her own disappearance. The implications were enormous. If she had been abducted, why would she repeatedly appear in public? If she was being held captive, why was she working? If someone was forcing her to use another name, why had she moved from place to place? And if she was hiding voluntarily, why? There was still no simple answer. But the investigation had something it had never possessed before. A direction. West Virginia had given investigators a possible trail. California eventually gave them the person. The distance between those two places was more than geography. It represented a transformation. Michelle had gone from a missing Pennsylvania mother to a woman living under an alias in another part of the country. She had crossed state lines. She had found employment. She had interacted with people who knew nothing about the search for her. She had created a version of herself that did not include the past. And yet the past remained close behind. Every photograph carried the possibility of recognition. Every new employer carried the possibility of discovery. Every person she met could eventually become someone who knew her real name. That is what makes an assumed identity so fragile. It depends on strangers not asking the right questions. It depends on nobody recognizing the face. It depends on the past remaining invisible. For Michelle, that invisibility lasted for years. Then television broke it. The case had been broadcast. Her story had been presented to people who had never met her. Her face entered homes far beyond Pennsylvania. Someone watching recognized her. That person made the connection. And suddenly, the woman known as Danielle Jones became Michelle McMullen again. It is difficult to imagine what that moment meant for the people who had spent years looking for her. For a family, the call saying that a missing relative may have been found can be almost as terrifying as the original disappearance. Because hope and fear arrive together. What if it is not her? What if it is? What if she is alive? What if she is injured? What if she does not want to come home? Those questions have no easy answers. In Michelle's case, the most important answer was the simplest. She was alive. The nightmare of discovering a body was gone. But another reality replaced it. Michelle had apparently chosen to stay away. That can be harder to understand than death because death has finality. A voluntary disappearance leaves an invisible question mark. It forces families to confront a painful possibility. Perhaps the person they were waiting for had also been choosing not to return. That does not make the pain disappear. It can make it more complicated. Michelle's family had spent years believing she might need to be rescued. Instead, investigators found a woman who had constructed a life elsewhere. The discovery also demonstrated why missing person investigations cannot be reduced to a single theory. At the beginning, investigators could not assume Michelle had left voluntarily. They had to consider danger. They had to examine the abandoned vehicle. They had to check hospitals, roads, and possible locations. They had to follow sightings. They had to investigate the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. And they had to examine the criminal allegations that existed before she vanished. That is the uncomfortable reality of a case like this. The truth does not always reveal itself in the first piece of evidence. Sometimes evidence contradicts itself. Sometimes the person who looks like a victim may also be avoiding authorities. Sometimes a disappearance is both a family tragedy and a criminal investigation. Michelle's story contained all of those elements. Before she disappeared, there had been accusations involving money missing from the church where she worked. After she disappeared, investigators discovered evidence that she had used other names. After years of searching, she was found in California. And once she returned to Pennsylvania, the legal consequences of the original investigation were waiting. The case eventually moved into the courtroom. There, the story became less mysterious but no less complicated. Michelle had to confront the allegations that had existed before she disappeared. The prosecution had its evidence. The defense had its explanation. And Michelle had to explain choices that had taken her across the country. According to accounts of the case, she said the money had been taken to pay for schooling. The explanation did not erase the allegations, but it provided some insight into the pressure surrounding the period before her disappearance. Disappearedblog.com, https://disappearedblog.com/found-alive/?UTM_source =ChatGPT.com. The legal system eventually reached its own conclusion. But there was another judgment that no courtroom could deliver. The judgment of the people who had waited for her. For those people, the central question was not how much money had been taken. It was why she had disappeared without saying goodbye. Why had her son been left behind? Why had the people closest to her been forced to live with uncertainty? Why had she chosen silence? Those questions remain deeply personal. A police report can document where someone was. A court can determine whether a law was broken. A television program can bring a missing person back into public attention. But none of those things can fully explain what happens inside a family when someone vanishes. That emotional aftermath is often invisible. The search ends. The missing person poster comes down. The phone calls stop. But the people who waited do not simply return to the way things were before. The case becomes part of family history. A painful chapter. A memory that cannot be deleted. Michelle's disappearance also illustrates how easily a person can become almost invisible in modern America. Different states. Different employers. Different names. Different communities. A person can cross hundreds or thousands of miles and become someone new to everyone around them. But there are limits. Fingerprints can expose identity. Records can expose movement. Photographs can travel. And sometimes the simplest technology of all remains the most powerful. Human memory. Someone sees a face. Something feels familiar. A name comes to mind. And a mystery begins to unravel. That is what happened here. Not because investigators found a secret grave. Not because a DNA laboratory produced a miraculous match. Not because a confession suddenly appeared. Because somebody recognized Michelle. That detail deserves to be remembered. In an era when true crime stories often end with forensic breakthroughs, Michelle's case ended through something much more ordinary. Recognition. A person watching television. A face appearing on the screen. A realization. A call. And the disappearance was over. But the story of Michelle McMullen is not really about an unsolved murder. It is about the uncertainty created when a person chooses to disappear. It is about how a family can spend years imagining every possible tragedy. It is about how investigators must remain open to possibilities that contradict the assumptions of the people closest to the missing person. And it is about how the truth can sometimes be both reassuring and painful at the same time. Michelle was not dead. That was the relief. Michelle had been living under another identity. That was the shock. She had apparently chosen to leave. That was the wound. The abandoned Honda had once looked like the opening scene of something much darker. In retrospect, it was the first visible sign that Michelle's life had changed direction. The car remained behind. She did not. Her identity remained behind. She did not. Her family remained behind. She did not. And for years, everyone who loved her was left standing at the point where the trail ended. Until California reopened it. The final image of the case is therefore not a body bag. It is not a courtroom filled with grieving relatives. It is not a detective holding a murder weapon. It is a woman who had been missing for years finally being identified as the person everyone had been searching for. Alive. Hidden in plain sight. A mother. A daughter. A former administrator. A woman who had used another name. And a missing person who had never been as far from the world as everyone feared. The mystery ended with her discovery. The questions did not. Because some disappearances leave behind evidence. Others leave behind silence. Michelle McMullen left both. And perhaps that is why the case remains so haunting. Not because the killer was never found. There was no confirmed killer. Not because the victim was never identified. She was. Not because the truth remained completely unknown. It did not. The haunting part is that the truth arrived with its own contradictions. She was alive. But she had been gone. She was found. But she had not wanted to be found. She returned. But the life she had left behind could never simply be restored. 3 years of absence could not be undone by a single police encounter in Oakland. A missing person investigation can end in a matter of minutes. A family does not heal that quickly. The television image that helped find Michelle eventually disappeared from the screen. The headlines faded. The public moved on. But for the people who had spent years wondering whether she was dead or alive, the memory remained. A car abandoned in Maryland. A hotel in West Virginia. An alias. Another state. Another identity. A face on television. And finally, the words every family searching for a missing person wants to hear. She has been found. Alive. The case that once looked like a potential homicide became something else entirely. A story about escape. Identity. Fear. Family. And the complicated consequences of disappearing. Michelle McMullen walked away from one life. Years later, someone recognized her in another. And that single moment proved something investigators had suspected for years. Sometimes the missing person is not waiting to be rescued. Sometimes the missing person is the one who has been trying not to be found. And sometimes, after years of searching, the truth is not hidden in a grave. It is standing somewhere in plain sight. For the people who had spent years searching for Michelle McMullen, the discovery in California should have been the moment everything became clear. Instead, it created a strange new chapter in a story that had already taken several unexpected turns. For years, Michelle had been represented by a photograph. A face frozen in time. A young woman with a family, a history and a life that had apparently stopped without explanation. But the woman investigators eventually located in Oakland was no longer living the life shown in that photograph. She had changed locations. She had changed names. She had changed the people around her. And according to accounts of the case, she had changed the story she told about herself. That meant investigators were not simply recovering a missing person. They were reconstructing a disappearance. Every location became part of that reconstruction. Every alias became another piece. Every job became another timestamp. Every sighting helped establish where Michelle had been after the night her family believed she vanished. The first major clue had been the Honda. The car had been found in Hagerstown, Maryland, after Michelle disappeared. Her belongings were reportedly still inside. To the people who loved her, the vehicle was terrifying because it appeared to be the last physical connection to their daughter. But the car also contained something investigators could not ignore. Michelle herself was missing. The vehicle was not. That distinction drove the early investigation. Had she left the vehicle voluntarily? Had someone forced her out? Had she been taken? Had she arranged transportation with another person? Had she simply wanted to make it appear that something had happened to her? At the time, there was no single answer. The investigation had to remain open. And then Michelle appeared again. Not in Pennsylvania. Not in Louisiana. Not along the highway between the two. In West Virginia. A woman believed to be Michelle was reportedly working under the name Monique Watson. That sighting was significant because it suggested something that investigators could not easily dismiss. Michelle could travel. Michelle could find work. Michelle could create another identity. And Michelle could disappear again. When the woman left before authorities could question her, the possibility of deliberate evasion became harder to ignore. But a deliberate disappearance does not automatically reveal its motive. That remained the central problem. Investigators could establish movement. They could establish aliases. They could establish employment. They could establish that Michelle was alive. But they could not look inside her mind. They could not know exactly what she feared. They could not know exactly what she wanted to escape. And they could not erase the fact that a 6-year-old boy had been left behind. That human detail remained at the center of the story. Michelle was not simply a woman with no attachments. She was a mother. Her disappearance therefore carried an emotional weight far beyond the legal investigation. Every day she remained missing meant another day her son did not know where she was. Every month meant another month of uncertainty. And every new sighting created a painful contradiction. If Michelle was alive, why was she not coming home? That question became more difficult with every mile she traveled. West Virginia. Then farther west. Eventually California. By the time Michelle was living under another identity in Oakland, she had traveled far enough to create a new world around herself. The people there did not necessarily know about Harrisburg. They did not know about the abandoned Honda. They did not know about the church investigation. They did not know about the missing person reports. To them, she was Danielle Jones. A woman with a job. A woman with a routine. A woman with a past they believed belonged to someone else. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of assumed identities. They do not require an entire world to accept a lie. They only require each new person to know a small piece of it. One employer knows a name. One friend knows a background story. One neighbor knows where someone works. Another person knows where she lives. No single person sees the entire picture. But investigators eventually can. They can connect the fragments. A photograph from Pennsylvania. A hotel record in West Virginia. An alias. A sighting. A television broadcast. A tip from California. Piece by piece, Michelle's second life became visible. And then came the recognition that ended the search. Someone watching the television program about the disappearance believed they recognized Michelle. That person contacted authorities. The tip was investigated. And the woman living as Danielle Jones was identified as Michelle McMullen. The search was over. But the emotional impact was only beginning. Imagine spending years believing that a loved one could be lying somewhere injured, imprisoned, or dead. Imagine seeing their photograph repeatedly. Imagine wondering whether every unidentified body might be theirs. Then imagine discovering that the person you were searching for had been alive the entire time. That kind of revelation does not produce one emotion. It produces several. Relief. Confusion. Anger. Gratitude. And questions that may never receive satisfying answers. The family finally knew Michelle was alive. But they also had to confront the fact that she had not contacted them. She had not simply been unable to return. She had apparently built a life away from them. For investigators, that fact mattered. For a family, it could hurt. The difference between those perspectives is crucial. Law enforcement asks, where is the evidence? Families often ask, why would she do this to us? Those are completely different questions. One can sometimes be answered. The other may remain unresolved for decades. Michelle's case demonstrates that distinction with unusual clarity. Investigators could trace her movements. They could establish that she had used aliases. They could locate her. They could return her to Pennsylvania. They could address the allegations that had existed before her disappearance. But they could not reconstruct every private thought that led her to leave. The public wanted a clean ending. Real life rarely provides one. There was no dramatic confession explaining every decision. There was no single document revealing the entire plan. There was no final statement capable of answering every question. Instead, there were pieces. Michelle had faced allegations involving missing money. She had lost her position at the church. A warrant had been issued. She disappeared. Her car was found. She appeared under another name. She disappeared again. She appeared thousands of miles away. And eventually someone recognized her. The sequence is clear. The motivation is not. That distinction is what keeps the case complicated. It would be easy to look backward and assume that every action was planned from the beginning. But investigations rarely work that way. A person can make one decision and then be forced to make another. A temporary escape can become permanent. A false name can become necessary when the original identity becomes dangerous. 1 day away can become 1 month. 1 month can become 1 year. And eventually, returning becomes more difficult than leaving. Michelle's disappearance may have evolved in exactly that kind of unpredictable way. What began as a departure could have become a new existence. What began as avoidance could have become concealment. And what began as a mystery for investigators became a completely different reality for the person living inside it. That is why the case cannot be understood simply as a story of a missing woman. It is also a story of consequences. Every choice created another consequence. Leaving Pennsylvania meant separation from family. Using an alias meant creating legal risk. Moving to another state meant abandoning familiar connections. Moving across the country meant making discovery more difficult. But every new identity also created another trail. A workplace. A residence. A transaction. A person who remembered her. A face captured somewhere. And eventually the most powerful trail of all. Her own face. Michelle could change her name. She could change her location. She could change the story. But she could not completely change the person strangers saw when they looked at her. That is what the television broadcast exposed. Her photograph crossed the country faster than she could. And one viewer recognized the connection. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. The very publicity that had been designed to find a missing woman eventually reached the woman who had apparently been trying to remain hidden. The search itself became the reason she was found. That is one of the strangest reversals in the case. For years, investigators had needed someone to see Michelle. Eventually, someone did. Not on a dark road. Not in an isolated building. Not through forensic evidence. On television. A face. A memory. A suspicion. A phone call. Then police. Then confirmation. The missing woman had been located. The mystery had changed. But the consequences continued. Michelle returned to a legal system that had not forgotten the allegations connected to her disappearance. The criminal investigation that had existed before she vanished was still waiting. The passage of time had not erased it. The courtroom therefore became the final destination of a journey that had begun with a disappearance. But it was not the courtroom ending that true crime stories often promise. There was no murder trial. No prosecutor describing a killing. No jury deciding whether someone had taken a life. Instead, the legal proceedings centered on the allegations that had existed before Michelle left. According to accounts of the case, she ultimately faced consequences connected to theft and forgery, while the years she had already spent away from her previous life became part of the broader story surrounding the case. Disappearedblog.com, https://disappearedblog.com/found-alive/?UTM_source =chatgpt.com. And once the legal process ended, another kind of silence remained. The public moved on. The headlines faded. The television episode became an old broadcast. The missing person photograph disappeared from circulation. But for the people closest to Michelle, the years could not simply be erased. The disappearance had happened. The fear had happened. The searching had happened. And the reunion, whatever form it took, could not return everyone to the exact moment before Michelle vanished. That is the hidden cost of a disappearance. Even when the missing person survives, the people left behind experience something real. They experience uncertainty. They experience grief without confirmation. They experience hope without evidence. They wake up every morning without knowing whether the person they love is alive. And when the answer finally arrives, it may not be the answer they imagined. Michelle's case therefore ended without the traditional final image of a cold case. There was no unsolved murder. No killer still walking free. No forensic mystery waiting for modern technology. Instead, there was an identity finally confirmed. A missing woman finally found. And a family finally given an answer. But answers are not always closure. Sometimes an answer simply replaces one question with another. For years the question had been, where is Michelle? After California, the question became, why did Michelle leave? And that second question was far harder to solve. Because evidence can tell investigators where someone went. It can show when a person crossed a border. It can establish that an alias was used. Can reveal a workplace. It can confirm an identity. But evidence cannot always explain a person's heart. That is where the case becomes less like a police investigation and more like a human tragedy. A woman disappeared. A family waited. A country became the search area. And eventually, a stranger watching television recognized a face. The mystery ended. But the reasons behind it remained tangled in the choices Michelle made before, during and after her disappearance. And perhaps that is the detail that makes the story linger. Michelle McMullen was not lost forever. She was not buried somewhere investigators never searched. She was not erased by a killer. She was alive. She had been living. She had been working. She had been moving forward. But somewhere along the way, she had left behind the people who were still standing in the place where she disappeared. And no matter how many miles she traveled, that unfinished past followed her. Until one day, it caught up with her on a television screen. The strange thing about Michelle McMullen's disappearance is that the mystery did not end when she was found. For most missing person cases, discovery is the final destination. The photograph comes down. The search ends. The family receives the phone call. Investigators close one chapter and move on to the next. But Michelle's case was different. Finding her answered the most frightening question. She was alive. Yet it created another question that was almost impossible to answer. Why had she wanted to disappear so completely? There was no single piece of evidence capable of explaining that decision. Instead, investigators had to reconstruct a sequence of events. A young woman in Pennsylvania. A financial investigation. A sudden disappearance. An abandoned Honda. a trail leading into Maryland, a sighting in West Virginia, an alias, another disappearance, then California, another name, another life, and finally recognition. The timeline was clearer than the motive. That distinction became increasingly important. Because when a person disappears voluntarily, the people left behind often search for a reason that can make the decision understandable. They look for one event, one argument, one threat, one secret, one person responsible. But sometimes there is no single explanation. Sometimes a series of pressures accumulate until leaving becomes the choice a person makes. That does not mean the people left behind understand it. It does not mean they accept it. And it certainly does not mean the consequences disappear. Michelle's family had been forced to live with uncertainty. The discovery of her abandoned vehicle had given them no certainty. Instead, it had intensified their fear. A car can be frighteningly silent. It does not tell investigators whether its owner left voluntarily. It does not tell a family whether someone was forced out. It cannot explain what happened next. The Honda simply remained behind. And Michelle did not. For days, weeks, and months, that fact became the center of the investigation. Every possible explanation had to be considered. The possibility of an accident. The possibility of abduction. The possibility of violence. The possibility that Michelle had left by choice. At the beginning, none could be dismissed completely. That is why missing person investigations can become so consuming. The absence of evidence is not proof of safety. A person can vanish without leaving obvious signs of a crime. And when the person has a reason to avoid authorities, the investigation becomes even more difficult. Michelle had such a complication. The allegations involving the church had existed before she disappeared. According to reports, investigators had been looking into missing funds and alleged forgery. A warrant was eventually issued. Michelle's father disputed the idea that the criminal investigation explained her disappearance, but law enforcement had to consider the possibility that fear of arrest had influenced her decisions. abcnews.com, https://abcnews.com/us/story?ID =$6005233 page $1 UTM_source =ChatGPT.com. That possibility did not make the disappearance less serious. It simply changed the questions investigators had to ask. If Michelle had left voluntarily, where would she go? Who might help her? What name would she use? How would she support herself? Would she contact anyone? Would she return? Would she continue moving? The answer to several of those questions emerged in West Virginia. Michelle had apparently found work. She had used another name. She had established a temporary routine. Then she vanished again. That second disappearance was perhaps more revealing than the first. The first disappearance could still be explained by many possibilities. The second suggested intention. Someone recognized her. Police were contacted. She left before they arrived. That sequence was difficult to reconcile with an accidental disappearance. The woman who had disappeared from Pennsylvania appeared to understand that being found could bring consequences. So she moved again. Farther away. California was different. It was not simply another nearby state. It was a new environment. A place where a person from Pennsylvania could become almost invisible. The Bay Area offered anonymity through distance. Michelle could become Danielle Jones. She could work. She could interact with people. She could create routines. And for a period it appeared to work. But anonymity has a weakness. It depends on nobody recognizing the person underneath the name. That weakness became the turning point. The television broadcast placed Michelle's photograph in front of people who had never met her. The case was no longer limited to investigators and relatives. Millions of potential eyes could see the same image. One of those eyes recognized her. The call to authorities transformed the investigation. Suddenly, the woman police had been searching for was no longer an abstract possibility. She had a location. She had an identity. She had a life. The police could confirm it. And when confirmation came, the search ended. But Michelle's story had already traveled far beyond the boundaries of Pennsylvania. Her disappearance had become an example of how quickly a missing person can become a national mystery. One day, a woman can be living an ordinary life. The next day, her family is staring at a photograph and asking strangers to help find her. The public often imagines missing people as helpless figures waiting somewhere to be rescued. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is not. Michelle's case demonstrated the uncomfortable alternative. The missing person may be actively creating distance. And if investigators assume otherwise, they can waste precious time pursuing a theory that does not fit the evidence. But investigators also cannot assume voluntary disappearance simply because there is no immediate evidence of violence. That assumption can be dangerous. The first responsibility is to find the person. The reason comes later. In Michelle's case, the answer eventually became clear enough to change the entire narrative. She had survived. She had traveled. She had used aliases. She had created a new life. And eventually she was found. Yet the case still carried a darker emotional dimension. A child had been left behind. That fact cannot be separated from the rest of the story. A 6-year-old does not understand financial investigations. A 6-year-old does not understand warrants. A 6-year-old does not understand why a parent might need another identity. A child understands only that someone is gone. And that absence becomes its own reality. Years later, when Michelle was located, the legal system could address the accusations surrounding her disappearance. But no court could reverse the years that had passed. No judge could restore every missed conversation. No sentence could erase the uncertainty. No document could return the family to the day before Michelle vanished. That is why the phrase "found alive" can be misleading. It sounds like a perfect ending. It sounds like the final page. But survival and reunion are not the same thing. A person can be alive and still be separated from the life they left. A family can be relieved and still hurt. A missing person can be found and still remain difficult to understand. Michelle's case contained all three realities. The investigation had succeeded. The family had an answer. The mystery had ended. But the emotional consequences continued. There was another layer to the story as well. The public had spent years trying to decide what Michelle was. Victim. Suspect. Missing mother. Runaway. Fugitive. Daughter. Criminal defendant. The truth resisted every simple label. She could occupy several of those categories at once. That is what makes real cases different from fictional stories. Fiction often provides clear roles. Victim. Detective. Killer. Evidence. Verdict. Real life can be much less organized. A person can be accused of a crime and still have people who love them. A person can disappear voluntarily and still cause genuine suffering. A family can search for someone while disagreeing completely about why that person left. An investigator can follow evidence while relatives follow intuition. Everyone can believe they are pursuing the truth. And everyone can be looking at a different part of it. Michelle's father believed his daughter was in danger. Investigators had to consider the possibility that she was avoiding arrest. The public saw a missing woman. California eventually saw a woman living under another name. All of those descriptions referred to the same person. That is the paradox at the center of the case. The identity was constant. The circumstances were not. Michelle McMullen remained Michelle. But to the people around her, she became someone else. Monique Watson. Then Danielle Jones. Names changed. Locations changed. Her past remained hidden. Until the television broadcast exposed it. That moment illustrates the extraordinary power of recognition. No sophisticated laboratory was required. No advanced database produced the breakthrough. A human being looked at a face and remembered a story. That was enough. In a case that had stretched across several states and several years, the final breakthrough was almost painfully simple. Someone knew. Someone remembered. Someone spoke. And investigators listened. The search ended in Oakland. But the story that began in Pennsylvania remained difficult to close emotionally. The legal proceedings provided an official conclusion to the allegations against Michelle. The discovery provided an official conclusion to the missing person investigation. But there was no official conclusion to the question of what Michelle truly felt during those years. That belongs to her. And perhaps that is the final boundary of the case. Investigators can document movements. They can document aliases. They can document charges. They can document the discovery. But they cannot completely document intention. There are places in every investigation where evidence ends and personal truth begins. Michelle's disappearance reached that boundary. The public could know where she had gone. The public could know that she had survived. The public could know that she had used another name. The public could know why law enforcement had been looking for her. But the deepest reasons remained private. And that privacy is part of what makes the case linger. There was no final dramatic revelation. No secret killer. No hidden accomplice. No murder weapon. The mystery did not explode. It slowly dissolved. A little more information here. A sighting there. A different name. A different state. A television appearance. A recognition. A confirmation. And suddenly, a woman who had been missing for years was no longer missing. That is how some cold cases end. Not with a dramatic discovery. Not with a confession. But with a quiet moment when someone realizes that the person they have been searching for is standing somewhere they never expected. Alive. Hidden. And living under a different name. Michelle's story began with fear. It ended with certainty. But certainty did not answer everything. It only made the remaining questions more personal. Why? Why did she leave? Why did she stay away? Why did she choose new names? Why did she allow the search to continue? Why did she not call home? Those questions remain more powerful than any headline. Because they are not questions about evidence. They are questions about choice. And choice is the one part of the case that no police report can fully explain. For years, Michelle McMullen was a woman whose whereabouts were unknown. Then she became a woman whose whereabouts were known but whose motives remained unclear. That transformation is the real ending. The mystery of where she was ended. The mystery of why she left did not. And perhaps it never will. There was one final irony waiting inside the Michelle McMullen case. For years, everyone had been looking for a missing woman. But the closer investigators came to the truth, the less the case resembled a conventional disappearance. The trail did not lead to a hidden grave. It did not lead to an isolated house. It did not lead to a killer who had spent years concealing a crime. It led to another identity. Then another. And eventually, to a woman living thousands of miles from where her family believed she might be. That reality forced investigators to reconsider almost every assumption they had made during the early stages of the search. The first assumption was that Michelle was in danger. That assumption was reasonable. A young mother disappears. Her vehicle is found abandoned. Her family cannot reach her. Her phone is silent. Her belongings remain behind. Those circumstances can trigger immediate fears of violence. Investigators cannot afford to assume otherwise. But as the months passed, the evidence began pointing in another direction. The sighting in West Virginia was critical. The woman believed to be Michelle had been working. She had apparently established a routine. She was not being held in an unknown location. She was moving through ordinary public spaces. And when she realized authorities might be coming, she left. That single detail carried enormous weight. It suggested awareness. It suggested intention. It suggested that Michelle knew her original identity could bring consequences. Still, the investigation could not stop there. A sighting is not proof of motive. An alias is not proof of intent. A person can hide for many reasons. Fear. Shame. Debt. Family conflict. Legal trouble. Personal crisis. Or simply the desire to start over. The investigators had to keep following the evidence. And the evidence continued moving west. California. Oakland. Danielle Jones. The name was different. The woman was the same. When authorities finally located her, the disappearance that had haunted Pennsylvania for years suddenly became a matter of confirmation. Identity was confirmed. The woman was alive. The search ended. But the emotional story did not. For Michelle's family, the years between 2008 and 2011 could not simply be erased. There had been birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, ordinary days. Days when someone probably wondered whether Michelle was thinking about home. Days when her son grew older. Days when her parents looked at the telephone. Days when a new tip arrived and hope returned. Then disappeared again. That cycle is one of the most painful parts of missing person cases. Hope is rarely constant. It rises with every credible sighting. It collapses with every dead end. Families learn to live between those two extremes. One morning they believe their loved one might walk through the door. The next they fear they never will. Michelle's family lived through that uncertainty for years. And when she was found, the uncertainty finally ended. But certainty brought its own pain. She had been alive. She had been living elsewhere. And she had not been living as Michelle McMullen. She had been Danielle Jones. Before that, she had reportedly been Monique Watson. Each name created distance. A new name can become a wall. It separates the person from their history. It makes ordinary questions dangerous. Where were you born? Who is your family? Where did you go to school? Why did you move here? What did you do before? For most people, these questions are harmless. For someone hiding an identity, every answer can become a risk. That makes the existence Michelle created increasingly difficult to maintain. But she managed it for years. She worked. She lived. She remained outside the reach of the people searching for her. Until television brought her old identity back into the room. The person who recognized her had never needed to meet her before. The photograph was enough. That is the strange power of a missing person investigation. A face can travel farther than a person. A photograph can cross state lines instantly. A name can be repeated thousands of times. A story can reach someone who has never heard it before. And somewhere in that audience there may be one person who knows something. In Michelle's case, that person was the difference between another year of uncertainty and the end of the search. The tip did not reveal every detail. It did not explain why Michelle had left. It simply revealed where she was. That was enough. Investigators went to California. They found the woman known as Danielle Jones. and they discovered Michelle alive. That moment must have been extraordinary for the investigators involved. The case that had once seemed to be moving toward an unknown ending suddenly had a living conclusion. But investigators also had to confront the legal issues that had preceded the disappearance. The allegations involving the church had not disappeared simply because Michelle had. The missing money remained part of the investigation. The alleged forged documents remained part of the investigation. The warrant remained part of the investigation. When Michelle returned to Pennsylvania, those matters followed her. The courtroom became another setting in the story. But again, this was not a murder trial. There was no homicide to prosecute. The legal questions concerned the alleged financial offenses. According to published accounts, Michelle faced charges related to theft and forgery, and later received a sentence involving probation and restitution. Disappearedblog.com, https://disappearedblog.com/found-alive/?UTM_source =chatgpt.com. The legal system could determine consequences. It could not determine every emotional reason behind the disappearance. That distinction is often lost when a case becomes a headline. Headlines want certainty. People want certainty. Viewers want a final explanation. But sometimes the evidence provides only part of the answer. Michelle's case is a perfect example. We know she disappeared. We know where her vehicle was found. We know investigators discovered sightings. We know aliases were used. We know she eventually reached California. We know someone recognized her. We know she was found alive. Those facts create a strong outline. But inside that outline are questions. What happened during the hours immediately after she left? Who helped her travel? How did she finance her movements? What did she tell people about her past? How much did her family know? Did she ever consider returning before she was located? Did she watch news reports about herself? Did she see the missing person posters? Did she understand how deeply her disappearance affected the people searching for her? Some of those questions may never have public answers. And that is not unusual. A missing person investigation can solve the location without solving the motivation. That is exactly what happened here. The disappearance was solved. The reason remained complicated. That difference is what separates a factual case from a neatly packaged television mystery. There is no requirement that reality provide a perfect ending. Sometimes the person is found. Sometimes the evidence is enough to establish what happened. Sometimes the remaining questions belong only to the people involved. Michelle's story also raises a difficult question about the meaning of the word missing. From the perspective of her family, Michelle was missing. From the perspective of the woman living in California, she was somewhere. She knew where she was. She knew who she was. But she was absent from the lives of people who had every reason to believe she might be in danger. Two realities existed simultaneously. Michelle was not physically lost. But she was emotionally unreachable. That is a different kind of disappearance. And it can be just as devastating. A missing person report treats absence as a problem to solve. A family experiences absence as an open wound. Those two things do not always close at the same moment. Michelle was found. The report could be updated. The investigation could move toward closure. But the family still had to process what had happened. Years had passed. The world had changed. Michelle had changed. Her son had changed. Nothing could return them to the exact moment before she disappeared. This is why found alive should never automatically be interpreted as happy ending. It is an ending. But happiness is more complicated. Relief can coexist with anger. Love can coexist with disappointment. Forgiveness can coexist with unanswered questions. And a family can be grateful that someone survived while still struggling to understand why they left. Those contradictions are not weaknesses in the story. They are the story. The public often wants to choose sides. Victim or suspect. Hero or villain. Truth or lie. But Michelle's case refuses to fit neatly into those categories. She was the subject of a missing person investigation. She was also the subject of a criminal investigation. She was a mother. She was a daughter. She was a woman who used aliases. She was a person eventually found alive. Each description is true. None explains everything. That complexity is what makes the case worth remembering. It demonstrates how quickly assumptions can change. On one day, investigators can be searching for a possible victim. Months later, they can be looking for a person who may be deliberately avoiding authorities. Years later, they can be standing in front of the same woman and realizing that the person they thought had vanished from the world had simply moved into another life. The case also demonstrates the value of persistence. If Michelle's family had stopped searching, the television exposure might never have reached the right person. If investigators had dismissed the West Virginia sighting, the trail could have disappeared. If the California tip had been ignored, Michelle might have remained hidden longer. Every piece mattered. None solved the case alone. The final answer came from accumulation. A photograph. A sighting. An alias. A location. A memory. A call. That is how real investigations often work. Not one spectacular clue. Thousands of ordinary details slowly becoming meaningful. And in the end, one ordinary person recognizing an extraordinary connection. Michelle McMullen had spent years trying to separate herself from her former identity. But the world she had left behind continued searching. The photograph continued circulating. The story continued being told. Her name continued appearing in databases and reports. And eventually, that old identity caught up with the new one. The woman called Danielle Jones became Michelle again. The woman called Monique Watson became Michelle again. The missing woman became found. And the search that had begun with fear finally ended with confirmation. But perhaps the most haunting image is still the beginning. A vehicle sitting alone. A phone that no longer answered. A wallet. An identification card. A family waiting. At that moment, nobody knew where Michelle was. Nobody knew whether she was alive. Nobody knew whether the case would become a homicide investigation. Nobody knew that years later, the answer would come from thousands of miles away. The silence of that first night made the disappearance terrifying. The truth years later made it complicated. Michelle had survived. That is the fact that matters most. But survival did not erase the years of uncertainty. It did not erase the choices. It did not erase the questions. And it did not erase the memory of the woman who had once disappeared without warning. The case eventually left the headlines. The investigation became history. The photograph stopped circulating as urgently. But somewhere in the story remains the image of a young mother who stepped out of one identity and into another. A woman who crossed state lines. A woman who left behind a car. A woman who became a stranger to the people who knew her best. A woman who was eventually recognized by someone who had only seen her story on television. And that is where the mystery finally comes to rest. Not with a killer. Not with a corpse. Not with DNA. But with a face. A face that had been missing for years. A face that someone remembered. And a truth that was hidden not in a secret laboratory or a forgotten crime scene, but in plain sight. Michelle McMullen was found alive. The mystery of where she had gone was solved. The deeper question of why she left remained a private part of her story. And perhaps that is the most honest ending this case can have. Some mysteries are solved by evidence. Others are solved by recognition. And some questions, even after the missing person comes home, remain unanswered. The most unsettling part of Michelle McMullen's story was never the distance she traveled. It was the silence. For years, the people who loved her had no idea what was happening on the other side of that silence. They did not know whether she was frightened. They did not know whether she was injured. They did not know whether someone had taken control of her life. They did not know whether she was trying to survive, or whether she was trying to escape. Every possibility carried a different kind of fear. And every unanswered day made the mystery harder to bear. When a person disappears, time becomes an enemy. The first hours are frantic. The first days are filled with calls, searches, and questions. Then the first weeks arrive. The initial urgency remains, but exhaustion begins to replace it. Friends begin asking whether there is any news. Relatives begin checking their phones more often. Investigators review the same information again. A possible sighting becomes another dead end. A new lead creates another burst of hope. Then silence returns. For Michelle's family, that cycle continued. But unlike many missing person cases, this investigation contained something unusual. The woman at the center of it was leaving traces. Not obvious traces. Not the kind investigators could immediately follow. But traces nonetheless. A different name. A different workplace. A different state. A different version of her life. Each one was small. Together they formed a path. The discovery of the Honda in Maryland had initially appeared to be the end of that path. Instead, it was the beginning. The vehicle established that Michelle had not simply vanished without leaving anything behind. Something physical remained. Investigators could examine it. They could determine what had been left inside. They could establish where it had been found. But the car could not tell them where Michelle had gone. That required people. And people are unpredictable witnesses. One person may remember a face. Another remembers a name. Someone else remembers a conversation. A fourth person remembers only that a woman checked into a hotel and later disappeared. None of those details seems powerful on its own. But investigators know that a case can turn on a single connection. Michelle's case eventually did. The West Virginia sighting mattered because it challenged the assumption that the missing woman had simply disappeared into the unknown. Someone had apparently seen her. She was not a ghost. She was moving. Working. Living. And using another identity. The name Monique Watson became associated with the investigation. But even that name was only temporary. When Michelle believed authorities were getting close, she left again. That movement created another question. Where would she go next? The answer was farther than anyone around her could have expected. California. The distance itself was significant. A person who wants to disappear within a familiar region may still be found through relatives, friends, former employers, or acquaintances. A person who crosses the country has a different advantage. The network of people who know them becomes smaller. The chance of accidental recognition decreases. A new job can become a new beginning. A new address can become a new identity. And a new name can become a shield. Michelle apparently used all three. By the time she was living in Oakland, she had become Danielle Jones. To people around her, that was the person they knew. They did not necessarily see a missing woman. They saw someone who worked. Someone who interacted with customers. Someone who had ordinary routines. Someone who appeared to belong there. That is what made the eventual discovery so striking. The woman was not hidden in an underground room. She was not isolated from society. She was living within it. She was simply living under a different name. And that is where the power of publicity entered the story. The missing person program had transformed Michelle's disappearance into a public image. Her photograph could travel into places investigators could never physically reach. A detective can knock on a limited number of doors. A television broadcast can reach millions. The investigators did not know which viewer might recognize Michelle. They did not know whether the person would remember the case. They did not know whether anyone would connect the face on television to a woman they knew personally. But eventually someone did. That is one of the most remarkable features of the case. The breakthrough was not hidden inside a complicated database. It was inside someone's memory. A face appeared. Something clicked. A possibility became a suspicion. The suspicion became a tip. And the tip became an investigation. This is how a disappearance that had stretched across years could suddenly move toward resolution. Not because the mystery had become simpler. Because the right person finally saw the right clue. When authorities located Michelle in Oakland, the central fear surrounding the case disappeared. She was alive. That fact alone changed everything. For the family, it meant that the worst outcome had not occurred. But it also meant confronting a difficult truth. Michelle had not been missing in the way they had imagined. She had been living elsewhere. The distinction between missing and hiding is enormous. One suggests helplessness. The other suggests agency. And when those two possibilities collide, emotions become complicated. A family can be grateful that someone survived and still feel abandoned. They can be relieved and angry at the same time. They can want answers and understand that the person may not be willing to provide them. They can love someone and still struggle to accept the choices that person made. Those contradictions cannot be solved by an investigation. They belong to the people involved. For law enforcement, the case had another dimension. Michelle's disappearance had occurred against the background of a criminal investigation. The allegations involving missing money and forged documents had not disappeared. They had simply been overshadowed by the disappearance. Once Michelle was found, the original legal questions returned. The investigation could resume from where it had been interrupted. The years in between did not erase the allegations. The discovery therefore represented both an ending and a beginning. The missing person case was effectively resolved. The criminal case could move forward. And Michelle had to confront the consequences of the decision she had made before leaving. That is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple, "Missing woman found alive" headline. The disappearance did not exist in isolation. There had been circumstances before it. There were consequences afterward. And in between was a period of uncertainty that stretched across several states. The public might want to know exactly what happened during every one of those years. But the public record does not provide every private detail. That is important. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to fill silence with speculation. If an explanation is missing, another one is invented. If a motive is unclear, a motive is assigned. If a timeline has gaps, the gaps are turned into dramatic scenes. But reality does not work that way. Sometimes a gap is simply a gap. Sometimes investigators never know exactly what happened during a particular hour. Sometimes a person refuses to explain everything. Sometimes the evidence establishes the destination but not the reason. Michelle's case contains those boundaries. We know the disappearance. We know the abandoned vehicle. We know the reported sightings. We know the aliases. We know the eventual discovery in California. But the inner story of those years cannot be reconstructed with certainty from public records alone. That uncertainty should not be mistaken for failure. It is simply the limit of what can be proven. And perhaps that is why the case remains so compelling. It begins like a potential murder mystery. A woman disappears. Her car is abandoned. Her family fears the worst. Then the story changes. A possible sighting appears. A false name emerges. The missing woman seems to be moving deliberately. Then another state. Another identity. And finally, a television viewer recognizes her. The entire case turns on a single fact. She was alive. That revelation is powerful precisely because it destroys the assumptions that had shaped the investigation. The audience expects death. The evidence reveals survival. The audience expects a killer. The investigation reveals concealment. The audience expects a body. The police find a woman. The headline changes. The story changes. The meaning of every earlier clue changes with it. The abandoned Honda no longer looks like the last trace of a victim. It becomes part of the trail left by someone who wanted to leave. The aliases no longer look like the work of an unknown criminal. They become evidence of a person trying to separate herself from her former identity. The West Virginia sighting no longer looks like an impossible break in the timeline. It becomes a bridge between Pennsylvania and California. And the television broadcast becomes the final link. That transformation is what makes the case so unusual. The same facts can mean completely different things depending on what investigators learn later. This happens frequently in missing person investigations. A clue does not exist alone. It exists inside a timeline. And until the timeline is complete, its meaning can change. Michelle's family saw the abandoned vehicle and feared violence. Investigators later saw evidence of movement. A hotel employee saw a woman using another name. Investigators saw a possible connection. A California resident saw a television program. Investigators received a lead. The pieces eventually aligned. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. But sufficiently. Enough to find Michelle. Enough to end the search. Enough to prove that the woman who had disappeared from Pennsylvania had survived years beyond the point when many feared she had died. And yet the final emotional image remains complicated. A family had searched. A woman had hidden. Authorities had investigated. A television viewer had recognized her. Everyone had played a different role in the same story. The search had been driven by love. The investigation had been driven by evidence. The disappearance had been driven by choices that remain difficult to understand. And the discovery had been driven by memory. That combination produced an ending nobody could have predicted on the night Michelle disappeared. She was not found in a place investigators had been searching for years. She was not discovered through a dramatic forensic breakthrough. She was not rescued from captivity. She was recognized. And sometimes, in the world of missing person investigations, recognition is enough to change everything. A face can become a clue. A clue can become a lead. A lead can become a location. A location can become an answer. And an answer can arrive years after the question was first asked. Michelle McMullen had been missing. Then she was found. But the story did not end there. Because being found does not erase being gone. And the years between those two moments remain the part of the story that no headline can completely explain. There is a moment in every missing person investigation when the case stops being about a photograph and becomes about a person. For Michelle McMullen, that moment came thousands of miles from Pennsylvania. Until then, she had been an image. A missing woman. A daughter. A mother. A name attached to a report. But when investigators found her in Oakland, the image became flesh and blood. Michelle was standing somewhere. Breathing. Working. Living. And suddenly years of uncertainty had a physical answer. Yet the discovery also revealed how little the public truly knew about the life she had been living. The disappearance had been visible. The years themselves were not. From the outside, the timeline seemed almost impossible. Pennsylvania. Maryland. West Virginia. California. Different names. Different jobs. Different surroundings. A woman could not cross that much distance without leaving some trace. But those traces were scattered. Each one belonged to a different place. Each one seemed disconnected. Until investigators understood that they were looking at one continuous journey. That realization transformed the case. The abandoned Honda was no longer an isolated mystery. It was the first known point in a larger movement. The Martinsburg Hotel was no longer an unrelated sighting. It was another point on the same path. The California identity was not a coincidence. It was the next stage. And the person behind all of those identities was Michelle. The significance of the aliases cannot be ignored. Names are more than labels. They connect people to records, to jobs, to addresses, to relatives, to schools, to histories. Changing a name can interrupt those connections, can create distance. For someone trying to disappear, that distance can be valuable. For investigators, it can be an obstacle. Michelle reportedly used more than one alias during the year she was away. That meant investigators had to search for a person who might not appear under her real name. A conventional database search can fail when the name itself is false. A missing person poster can fail when the person no longer answers to the name printed beneath the photograph. But a photograph is different. A face does not change simply because the name does. That is why the television broadcast became so important. The image remained connected to the original identity. Michelle could introduce herself as Danielle Jones. The screen could still show Michelle McMullen. And somewhere in California, someone noticed the difference. That person understood that the woman they knew might be the woman they had seen on television. It was a fragile connection. But it was enough. The tip reached investigators. The investigation moved. And Michelle was found. The entire country had spent years looking at a missing person photograph. The answer had been living behind another name. That is a difficult reality for a family to absorb. Because when someone disappears, loved ones often imagine that the person is somewhere waiting to come home. They imagine rescue. They imagine reunion. They imagine the moment the front door opens. But Michelle's story offered something more complicated. The reunion was connected to a choice. She had not simply been waiting. She had been living. That difference changes the emotional meaning of everything that came before. The family had been searching while Michelle had apparently been building another existence. There is no easy way to describe the emotional collision created by that fact. Relief remains. The relief that she was alive. But alongside it can come anger. Questions. Disappointment. Confusion. And perhaps a feeling that the person who had finally been found was not exactly the person everyone remembered. 3 years can change a person. 3 years can change a child. 3 years can change a family. 3 years can change the way people understand one another. The woman who disappeared in 2008 was not necessarily the same woman investigators found in 2011. Not because her identity had changed. Because time had passed. The case therefore became more than a search for a missing person. It became a story about what happens when someone steps outside their former life and remains away long enough for that absence to become permanent. Every missing person investigation has a clock. The first hours. The first days. The first weeks. Then the months. Eventually the years. As time passes, the possibility of a voluntary disappearance becomes harder to distinguish from every other explanation. Evidence disappears. Witnesses forget. Records become harder to locate. People move. Businesses close. Phones change. Addresses change. A trail that was obvious in September may be almost invisible by the following year. Michelle's case had one advantage. She was apparently creating new lives in different places. Those lives generated new witnesses. Someone remembered her. Someone saw her. Someone eventually recognized her. In another case, those connections might never have been made. That is why the television program mattered so much. Publicity does not guarantee a result, but it increases the number of people who can contribute to a search. A missing person can be searched for by hundreds of investigators, but millions of ordinary people can become observers. A hotel employee, a neighbor, a customer, a former coworker, a television viewer. Any one of them may hold the missing piece. Michelle's case proved that principle. The breakthrough did not come from someone who had been assigned to the case. It came from recognition. The public often imagines detectives solving mysteries alone. In reality, many investigations depend on people who were never part of the investigation at all. People who notice. People who remember. People who decide that a strange coincidence is worth reporting. The person who recognized Michelle did exactly that. And that decision changed the trajectory of the case. Without that call, Michelle might have remained under the name Danielle Jones longer. Perhaps much longer. The investigation might have gone cold. The family might have continued searching. Another birthday might have passed. Another year might have been added to the timeline. But that did not happen. Someone remembered. And the years of uncertainty ended. The discovery also provided a lesson about the limits of physical distance. Michelle had traveled across the country. But distance did not erase the past. Her photograph followed her. Her family continued searching. Her original identity remained active. And the story eventually reached her new community. No matter how far she traveled, the person she had once been remained part of the public record. That is the weakness of disappearing in the modern age. You can leave a place. You can change your name. You can change your job. But your former identity may already exist in thousands of places. Old photographs. School records. Employment records. Police reports. Television programs. Family memories. The past is difficult to erase completely. Michelle discovered that when someone recognized her, the face survived the name. The story survived the distance. And the investigation survived the years. Once Michelle was returned to Pennsylvania, the unresolved legal issues came back into focus. The allegations involving the church had existed before the disappearance. They were not created by the search. They were part of the circumstances surrounding it. That matters because the disappearance cannot be separated entirely from what happened before it. A person does not disappear in a vacuum. There is always a before. There is always a life that existed immediately before the disappearance. There are relationships, financial pressures, arguments, responsibilities, fears, decisions. Sometimes the disappearance is a response to those circumstances. Sometimes it is unrelated. Sometimes investigators never establish the exact connection. In Michelle's case, the financial allegations formed an important part of the public record. She had been accused of taking money from the church where she worked. She had faced allegations of theft and forgery. Her father disputed the idea that those allegations explained her disappearance. But after she was found, the legal system addressed those accusations. The story therefore returned to where it had begun. Not with a murder. Not with a homicide investigation. But with the unresolved consequences of events that preceded the disappearance. Michelle's legal problems did not disappear when she did. They simply waited. And once she was found, they were waiting for her. The outcome did not produce the dramatic ending that a conventional true crime story might promise. There was no murder conviction. No life sentence. No revelation that a killer had been hiding for years. Instead, the legal system dealt with the financial offenses connected to the original investigation. That may sound less dramatic, but it reveals something important. The greatest mystery in Michelle's case was never who killed her. Nobody did. The greatest mystery was why a young mother would leave behind her identity and disappear across the country. That question has no forensic answer. There is no laboratory test for motivation. No fingerprint can explain regret. No DNA sample can explain fear. No surveillance camera can show what a person was thinking when they decided to leave. Evidence can tell us where Michelle was. It can tell us what name she used. It can tell us that she survived. But it cannot completely explain why. That is where every investigation eventually reaches its limit. There are facts. And there are meanings. The facts can be documented. The meaning belongs to the people involved. For Michelle, the disappearance may have represented escape. For her family, it represented loss. For investigators, it represented a case to solve. For the public, it became a mystery. For the television viewer who recognized her, it became a moment of realization. One person. One face. One memory. One phone call. That was enough to bring the entire story back into focus. And once the case was solved, the most dramatic element was not what investigators found. It was what they did not find. They did not find a corpse. They did not find a murder weapon. They did not find evidence of a killer. They found Michelle. Alive. That single word changed the entire story. For years, the possibility of death had hung over the investigation. Then it vanished. What remained was the reality of survival. Michelle had survived the years when her family feared she was dead. She had survived the uncertainty. She had survived the consequences of leaving. But survival does not necessarily mean everything is restored. A person can survive physically while relationships change permanently. A family can survive the disappearance while never forgetting it. A child can grow older while still remembering the parent who vanished. And a person who left may eventually have to face the impact of that decision. That is the part of Michelle's story that cannot be measured by police records. It exists in memory, in family conversations, in photographs, in the silence that followed the discovery. The case may have been solved, but the experience remained. And perhaps that is why the Michelle McMullen story continues to feel unsettling. It does not offer the emotional certainty of a conventional crime story. There is no monster to blame. No final que enfrentaschen. No justice delivered against a murderer. Instead, there is a woman who disappeared. A family that searched. An investigation that crossed state lines. And a discovery that came because someone remembered a face. The story began with a question. Where is Michelle McMullen? Years later, the answer came. She was alive. She was in California. She was living under another name. And she had been there while people back in Pennsylvania continued searching. That answer ended one mystery. It created another. And that second mystery may be the one that remains longest. Why did she choose to disappear? Why did she stay away? Why did she allow the search to continue? And what did she feel when she finally realized that the past had found her? Those questions belong to the silence between the documented facts. And sometimes that silence is the most haunting part of all.